I don't know if you noticed, but the world is a mess. And there's actually a real threat in the mess. Being in the middle of a mess makes you feel powerless. It makes you feel cornered, and it can even leave you feeling defeated, like you don't really want to keep going. You just want to give up. Well, our world is a messy world. Just look at the events of this week in the news, and you realize that we have lots and lots of problems. The mess is a threat. Jesus put it this way in the parable of the sower, describing it in Matthew chapter 13, verse 22. He said, as for what was sown among thorns, in other words, the word of God, the gospel that was sown among thorns, that is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches chokes the word and proves it unfruitful. In other words, Jesus is saying that some believers get so overwhelmed with the mess of life or the tyranny of the urgent or the worries of the day that they never bear the fruit God wants them to bear. Now, what is that fruit? Well, that fruit is multiplication of disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And as disciples who want to multiply until the whole world hears, that means if we focus too much on the mess, it can have catastrophic results in our disciple-making intentions and lives. It can choke out our fruit. We can prove unfruitful. But the problem is this: how do you escape the mess? Because the world seems messier, and it seems more difficult than ever to escape it because it's right in your face all of the time. And so what do you do about it? How do you navigate a messy life? We're beginning 1 Peter today, and we're only covering one verse today because this is kind of our introduction to the epistle. And so one verse from 1 Peter we're beginning with. 1 Peter 1:1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And so let's just break this down and explain it one part at a time. Who is Peter? Peter's introduced to us in the Gospels. He's one of the first disciples that Jesus calls. And you can see his story in a few of the Gospels, but from the Gospel of Luke, we get a longer account of the calling, the invitation that Jesus gives to Peter to follow him. See, Peter was a fisherman, and he's been fishing all night long, and he has nothing. No fish to lay claim of, to sell at the market. And so he's tending his nets and cleaning and packing up for the day. When Jesus comes, and he's teaching the crowds. And the crowds are increasing, and so Jesus says to Peter, hey, Peter, can I get in your boat and push off from the shore, and I'll teach from there? And who are you going to? You're not going to say no to this traveling rabbi. And so Peter says yes, and he goes, and Jesus is teaching. And then after he's done teaching, Jesus says, let's go out one more time to throw out the net. Now you have to realize that they've been fishing all night long, which is when you're supposed to fish, and they've had no luck. And now here's this carpenter who knows nothing about fishing telling them what to do. But honoring him, Peter agrees. And they go out and they throw the net. And the net is so full of fish that as they're pulling it into the boat is practically starting to tip over. And Peter has a very unusual reaction. We think he would stand up for joy and begin cheering. But instead, he looks at Jesus and he realizes in that moment that there's something different about that man. And he realizes his own sinfulness. He falls to the floor at Jesus' feet, and he tells Jesus, not thank you for the fish. He says, depart from me. I'm a wicked, sinful man. And Jesus props Peter up, and he says, Peter, follow me, and you will fish for people. That's where we're first introduced to this man called Simon, who will become Peter. And we see the renaming of Simon to Peter in Matthew chapter 16, when essentially Jesus turns to his followers. He says, who do people say that I am? And Peter confesses to Jesus, and he says, you are the Christ. In other words, you are the rescuer, the promised one, the one that our people have been waiting for, the Son of David, the great Messiah, the one who is actually going to bring about all of the promises of the covenants. And Jesus turns to him and he says, you're right, Simon. flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father by the Spirit. And he says, I call you Peter, Petros, rock. He says to him that the early church would be built upon the rock of Peter's confession, the rock of Christ and the gospel, and the person of Peter as he will be a future leader. See, this is how the gospel, how the kingdom goes forward. It goes forward through people who cling to the confession of Christ, the hope of the rock of ages, the gospel, and as people cling to that, the kingdom goes forward. It's through people who believe, people like me, people like you, as we cling to the rock, Jesus. Now think about this. Jesus says to Peter, you're going to be a leader among leaders in this early church, this early movement of God. And he says to him, I'm going to use you, but think about who Peter was. He was a fisherman. He was uneducated. He was impulsive. We see Peter frequently having foot and mouth syndrome, like when Jesus is transfigured and we see the glory of Christ on Mount Hermon, and Peter doesn't know what to do because he sees Jesus and he sees Moses and he sees Elijah, and he says, I got an idea. Let's make some tents. That's his big plan. Matter of fact, Jesus even calls Peter one time Satan, the adversary. He says, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God. We see later after Jesus' arrest that Peter denies Jesus 3 times, even though frequently before he would say things like, even if everybody else abandons you, I never will. I'll die for you, Jesus. Well, apparently he's willing to die, but not when it's a little girl who's accusing him, because that's who he basically cowers before. As he's warming his hands around the fire, a little slave girl says to him, aren't you one of the ones who was with Jesus? See, Peter is all of these things, a fisherman, uneducated, impulsive, an adversary, scared of little girls, but he's a sinner saved by grace, forgiven and restored by Jesus, as we see at the end of the Gospel of John. See, the beauty of the gospel, the beauty of the gospel multiplying in our lives, the beauty of multiplication is that it's not about superstars. It's about fishermen and uneducated people and impulsive people and people who behave like idiots sometimes and sometimes are afraid of silly things. It's about ordinary people being used by an extraordinary God. See, Peter isn't special because he's awesome. Peter is used because he's willing. And God wants to use us too. In Acts chapter 1, through verse 10, we see Peter being that early rock that the church needs as it's being founded. We see God turn this fisherman truly into a fisher of men, meaning he evangelized and discipled. He obeyed King Jesus. We see that in Acts chapter 2, Peter proclaims the gospel and 3,000 men follow Jesus. God uses this uneducated man to highlight the wisdom of God, the boldness of the Spirit. The Pharisees look at him and they say, who is this uneducated man and how is he so bold? God took Peter's impulsive nature and redeems it to make him bold in the face of danger and persecution. God takes his failings and he turns it around to leverage that for courage and for desire to keep failing forward for Christ. See, Peter is a weak man who became strong in the grace of Jesus. That's who's writing this letter. And because Peter's a man just like us, Peter has things to say to us, and he has the credibility to say it. But he also says here that he was an apostle, Peter, an apostle. And so what's an apostle? Well, the word apostle can really be used in a few ways. First, there's the capital letter A apostle, big A apostles, and that's basically guys who wrote the Bible, okay? There's no more big A apostles anymore, people who are writing the scripture. The Bible is closed. This is not to be confused with little a apostle, apostolically gifted people, like missionaries, church planners, or as I often say, spiritual entrepreneurs. These are people who want to pioneer and move the ball forward into unknown territory. Those are apostolically gifted people. But the word apostle at the most basic level in the Greek simply means to be sent with a message. It means to be an ambassador. And this is a reality that's true of all believers. That's what Paul argues in 2 Corinthians, that you are an ambassador of Christ and a new creation, that you cannot be a believer without being an ambassador. It's part of your DNA. The question isn't, am I an ambassador? The question is, am I an ambassador who's faithful to my actual kingdom? Or am I a traitor who's representing the false kingdom, the kingdom of Satan? See, there were the original apostles. There's no more of them anymore. There are people who are apostolically gifted, and we see that in Ephesians 4, when Paul says that God gave prophets and apostles and evangelists and shepherds and teachers for the equipping of the church until it reaches maturation and unity. And then we realize that we also are all apostles on some level because we're sent with good news, like a town crier, that Jesus Christ died to save sinners and he's coming again. Now, the point is this: you have an apostolic role, even though you didn't write the Bible. And so Peter, what he has to say, as someone who knows a lot about this, has wisdom for us in this 1 Peter epistle that is directly applicable to your life and to mine. Now, who is he writing to? He says right here, Peter, an apostle to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion, and then he names these 5 towns. Now, one thing you need to know as we look at 1 Peter is that 1 Peter is loaded with Old Testament references, and we're going to explain those as we go through the book. The elect exile in diaspora, or dispersion, is a reference to Israel in the Old Testament. But here, Peter is very craftily creating a new meaning. You see, in the Old Testament, that's the first part of the Bible, the Old Covenant, elect refers to Israel being chosen by God as his special people. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 to 8, which I'll read. God says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the people who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any of the other people that the Lord has set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest." In other words, he didn't choose them because they're the strongest or the mightiest or because they have the most people. Verse 8, "But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." And so, in other words, God says, you are my chosen people, my elect people. It's the same idea. And I chose you because I'm God, and I chose you, and I made a promise to Abraham, and I made a promise to Adam and Eve in the garden after they fell that I was going to crush the serpent's head. And I narrowed that down from Adam and Eve to the line of Abraham, and from Abraham to Isaac. And I narrowed that down from Isaac to Israel, to Jacob and his sons. I made these promises, and I keep my promises. You are my elect, chosen people for a purpose. Out of all of the nations of the earth that have been dispersed, you are my inheritance. You are my chosen elect people. See, here's this rich Old Testament concept that Peter is now claiming for us as God's chosen people. See, as with much in the Bible, the Old Testament becomes a sort of object lesson to teach us a rich spiritual truth. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the towns that Peter is writing to, they're not Jewish towns. And they're not even Gentile towns, it's non-Jewish, with large Jewish populations. Peter is writing to Gentile, non-Jewish towns, Gentile background believers, and maybe some Jewish believers folded in as well. See, this letter, 1 Peter, is what's called an encyclical letter, which is just a fancy word for a letter that was passed around. So Peter is using this term elect, but he's not writing to Jewish believers, he's writing to Gentile believers. And so Peter is redefining this term and saying that it's not just the Jewish people, the remnant who are elect, it's all who have faith in God, in this gospel of Jesus Christ. All of us are elect. This isn't limited to ethnicity or to previous creed or any human factor, but by faith. By faith we become children of Abraham, as Paul argues in the book of Romans. By faith we become sons of God, adopted into his family, as we see in Ephesians chapter 1 and continuing in the book of Ephesians. By faith we see prophesied and then fulfilled a people who were not people become his chosen elect people. See, all believers are God's chosen people, just as Israel is God's chosen people. But he says that they are elect exiles. And so what's that about? Exile typically refers to the exile out of the promised land. You see, the Jews were given something called the Mosaic Covenant. We think of that as like the 10 Commandments that we read in the first 5 books of the Bible, also called the Pentateuch or the Torah. And they were given a set of laws that they had to follow. And God, this was a conditional covenant. God said, if you break these laws, I'm going to remove you from the promised land. And so the promised land is like their home. And God says, if you break the laws, I'm going to kick you out. I'm going to kick you out of my house. And so after numerous generations of failure and rebellion and just open insubordination against God and his chosen kings, what we see is that God allows and uses the various surrounding nations to come in to take control of the promised land, Israel, and then to remove those people from the promised land into other places like Babylon and Assyria. And so this is called the exile. The period where they're exiled out of their own land and they're living in dispersion in the other areas of the ancient Near East. So that's what exile typically refers to. But there's another type of exile that I think Peter's actually referring to. And that's our exile from the presence of God in Genesis chapter 3. See, the Bible is an amazing book, and it has these overarching themes, this meta-narrative, this thread that goes throughout. And so we see that ever since Genesis chapter 3, we have been in exile as humanity. We've been exiled out of the presence of God, Eden, where heaven and earth collided, this mountain temple. And because we've been exiled out of that, we've been just constantly desperate to get back into Eden, to return to Eden. J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, said that there is within us this craving to return to Eden and within each and every one of us. And so ever since Genesis 3, mankind has been exiled from the presence of God. And this is why the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, the final revelation of Jesus Christ, we see it comes full circle with these complete bookends as Eden is restored. You see, when you think of heaven, when you think of your home, your eternal home, you shouldn't think of heaven as this place with clouds and little fat babies shooting arrows and we all just sing around and play harps all day. That's not what heaven is. That's not what our eternal home will be. The end of all things is actually a recreation, a re-overlapping of a space where heavens, which means the spiritual realms, and earth completely overlap. It's a return to Eden. New heavens and a new earth, this new Edenic paradise. See, right now, we are exiled, but one day we will fully return home. But where is home for us? I live in Cape May County, but is that really my home? Where is home for a son, but with his father? Where is home for a daughter with her family? Where is home for a prince or a princess, but in the kingdom of their family? You see, we live as exiles, and we will not be home until we are home with the Lord, either in death or ultimately in the new creation. And so Peter says these are elect exiles. In other words, this isn't your home. You're living in the mess. And so what do we do while we wait here? Well, we wait for our final home, and we bring as many adopted brothers and sisters with us as possible until the restoration of all things. What about this word diaspora or dispersion? Elect exiles in diaspora. See, the diaspora or the dispersion is similar to exile, but a little different. You see, because when the exile came in and the Jewish people were scattered across the ancient Near East, and then they were allowed to return to the promised land, some of them didn't return. Some of them stayed dispersed around the ancient Near East, and they didn't come back to the motherland. And so even in Peter's day, the exile was over, but the people, the Jewish people, were still dispersed. The Jews were scattered around the ancient world, and they were waiting until the final regathering in Jerusalem in the last days. Of course, the Jews are still scattered, as we know, and they won't be regathered completely until the great revival of Jews happens at the end of days. But this isn't what Peter is referencing. What Peter is referencing is that us too, we are on a pilgrimage to the city of God, that we are as believers, as followers of Christ, are exiled, dispersed. We are scattered all over the world. And we're waiting until the final regathering of all of God's people, until we are finally together in the New Jerusalem, like we see in the prophetic writings. Now, this is interesting when you realize that the word for church actually is the word for gathering. We're currently gathered in pockets of God's people, ecclesia, gathered together, but we are waiting as dispersed. We're dispersed. I don't live in your town. You don't live in my town. If you're listening from another place, or we don't live on the same street, we're dispersed. But one day we will finally be gathered together, no longer in dispersion, but we will live in our Father's house. Jesus said, I went ahead of you to prepare a place for you. We experience a gathering right now in part, but we will experience the ultimate regathering one day. And so what's the point of all this? Peter says, I write to you, elect exiles in dispersion. Peter's writing to us too. See, if you're a believer, you are an elect exile, currently in dispersion, in diaspora, waiting to go home. That's your reality. It's the same reality that Peter has. It's the same reality the audience that he's writing to has. So why did Peter write it? Peter wrote it because he wants you, he wants me, he wants them to know how to live in this giant mess. See, more specifically, Peter wants to give his readers and to give us the source of encouragement in the midst of persecution, in the midst of the mess in which they lived, in which we live. See, because it was in Peter's day that things started to get super gnarly. Now, we see, even beginning with Jesus, that people didn't like Jesus. Jesus said, if they hate me, they're going to hate you. So don't be surprised. And they killed Jesus. And so what makes you think they're going to celebrate you? But we see this continues, and it gets worse and worse and worse in the book of Acts, that Peter gets arrested. He gets thrown in prison. We see Stephen get stoned. We see Paul, after his conversion, we see he's beaten with rods, and he's almost stoned to death. And we see persecution increases and increases and increases, until we see Nero, they think the Emperor Nero burned down Rome and then blamed the Christians. And Nero used to take Christians and put them on stakes and use them as torches in his garden for dinner parties. And they would throw Christians to the lions in the Colosseum, and so on and so forth. The early apostles, so many of them died terrible deaths because of their faith. Because of their faith. But Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. See, Peter writes this because the world in which we live is messy. It is tumultuous. But it won't be a mess forever. And you won't live in the mess forever. But as long as you're alive, you're going to live in the mess. As long as you're alive, you're going to live in the mess. And so if you're waiting for the mess to disappear, you're waiting for the wrong thing if you're waiting for it on this earth. Because the mess isn't going to disappear until you're home. Because you're in exile waiting to be home. You're in diaspora waiting to be regathered. You're a traveler passing through. You're an ambassador living in an enemy nation waiting to go home. What does that mean? Practically, one, don't expect this mess, this world, to satisfy you the way only your true home can. The reason why, even though you added another bathroom to your house and you still don't feel like it's good enough, is because you're actually craving another home. It also means, number two, don't get too worked up by the mess. You turn on the news and you want to go all Hulk, right? Because you're so mad. Don't get too worked up about the mess. Expect the mess. We live in a messy world, and it's going to be this way until Jesus destroys it and makes it all new. And the third thing is, don't get too distracted by your temporary home when you're waiting for your future home. See, that was why so many Jewish people didn't come back to the promised land. Even after exile, they got settled. They liked it in Babylon. They had a nice garden. They had a nice, 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath. They had a boat. They had all the stuff that they like, and now they were allowed to come back, and they don't want to. Don't get too distracted by the temporary home, by this life. The unseen is more a reality than the seen. See, this week, you're going to turn on the news, and you're going to see more mess. You're going to go to work and there's going to be a mess. You're going to wake up, feel like you're doing pretty dandy, then your kids are going to wake up and your whole world's going to be a mess. You are going to have real manifestations of the messiness of life in your existence this coming week. And so when that happens, we need to step back and realize, I'm in exile. I'm in dispersion, but I'm chosen by God, and this isn't my home. This home won't be what I want it to be. It won't satisfy, and it isn't worth investing all my energy into it. Instead, I need to invest in the unseen, eternal future home. I need to work towards that home. Look, if you work in the sewers like you're a Ninja Turtle, if you work in the sewers, you're not bothered by the sewers. You know to expect a mess. Shouldn't it be the same with us? Like, we know Jesus said this world is mess. We know Jesus said that in this life you will have trouble. And so why do we seem so shocked when we actually experience the trouble ourselves? Look, you have a future home, and it's a wonderful home. It's your dream home. Jesus went to prepare it for you. So why does God leave you in the mess today? See, you have a future wonderful home, but the world around you will be born, will live, and will die in the mess without hope. But you have hope. And you know that they have a hope too that they are ignorant to. You have a wonderful story in the gospel about Jesus Christ, who took on the messiness, the likeness of sinful flesh, to step into our mess, to redeem us out of the muck and the mire, to set our feet on solid ground, and then to adopt us into his family, make us his bride, and give us a new home. This is the gospel. Jesus Christ died to save sinners. And he's coming again to bring us to our forever home. I want to leave you with two verses to consider as you reflect on this mess. Hebrews 11:13, speaking of the great men and women of faith, says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things that they were promised, but they saw them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." Or to read it in another translation, all these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it from a distance and they welcomed it. And they agreed that they were foreigners and nomads, exiles here on earth. And then John 16:33, "Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world." See, the word hope doesn't mean wistful thinking in the Bible. Hope is an eager expectation, an eager longing of what is guaranteed to come. And in Jesus, despite the mess of today, despite the mess of this past week, despite the mess of this coming week, despite the mess of whatever is going to happen when it all goes down, we as believers, as elect exiles living in dispersion, we have unshakable hope. Therefore, we can attempt the impossible without fear. And we can be bold and courageous in the face of adversity because we have hope. And Peter's going to spend the rest of this epistle explaining why we have hope and how that hope should impact our lives today.